When someone shapes you, gives you form, what happens when they leave? Do you shape yourself? Gather your own clay? Do you break down? Start again? There was a person here. They're gone now. This video contains spoilers for the original Silent Hill trilogy, as I'll be primarily discussing Silent Hill 3's narrative, along with relevant details from Silent Hill 1 and 2. If you haven't played or seen any of these games, I would highly recommend either tracking down copies to play for yourself, or watching a few Let's Plays. They're extremely influential horror games with deep character writing and themes, and they're well worth your time. This video will also contain discussions and depictions of stalking, teenage pregnancy, suicidal ideation, childhood abuse and trauma, and parental death. Alright, so Silent Hill 3. Initially starting life as a rail shooter, which would have been awesome, Silent Hill 3 was developed concurrently with Silent Hill 4 The Room. During development, the game shifted focus into being a direct narrative sequel to Silent Hill 1, focusing on Heather Mason and tying up loose narrative and thematic ends from both it and 2. Now, there's a little bit of confusion on the direction the game took after being a rail shooter, although it has been confirmed that a bit of development time was lost due to that. That said, I did want to at least clear up the common misconception that Silent Hill 3 was not intended as a psychological horror game in the vein of Silent Hill 2. Some of this gets attributed to a quote from Akira Yamaoka during an interview with Game World from 2005. Originally, the intention was not to make Silent Hill 3 a direct sequel to the first game. In fact, the scenario was completely different, but fans seemed to want to tie up some loose ends, so we tried that, even though some on the staff did not agree with the decision. Now, on its own, this doesn't tell us much, as we have no idea what the original scenario for Silent Hill 3 was going to be beyond staying in the vein of Silent Hill 2, as Akihiro Imamura states. Another thing is we really didn't want to use a similar template as SH2 for the game that followed it. That was another deciding factor in changing SH3. So while, yes, some development decisions for Silent Hill 3 were influenced by fan reactions to 2 at the time, it's important to recognize that the staff already agreed that having a similar setup to 2 wasn't going to work creatively, and notably, none of the creators ever said that the game's focus wasn't going to be on the main character dealing with personal demons and trauma, just that the template of how that was going to be presented wasn't the same, which is clear from an analysis of Silent Hill 3's story, characters, and themes.
Dad?
So with that clarified, while I'm certainly going to be getting into more depth as the video goes on, in the broad strokes, I find Silent Hill 3 to be the best game of the original Team Silent games. I find Heather to be the most relatable and complex protagonist of them, the setting to be very interesting and unique, the music and sound design to be excellent, and its story and themes worthy of the series. Of course, that isn't to say the other games are not great as well. I find them to be some of the best horror games ever made. It's just for me personally, I resonate a lot more with Silent Hill 3 than all the others. Hopefully in this video I'll be able to explain my thoughts as to why well enough that you'll be able to understand my perspective. That said, my opinion on this matter is not monolithic, and in the description I'll be providing links to other critiques of the game that I found to be insightful. Now, with that settled, let's properly begin. So while the majority of this review will be a plot, gameplay, and thematic analysis, I do want to take some time to also heap praise on the game's audio and visuals. This is easily one of the best looking games to come out of the PS2 era, and is a good reason why strong art direction will never really age. The voice acting is also pretty strong across the board. Not the HD collection voices, fuck the HD collection voice, treading that fine line between realistic, off-putting, and campy that many of the early Silent Hill games handled so well. The standout, of course, is Heather Morris's voice acting, who also did the motion capture for Heather. She perfectly captures that awkward teen vibe.
I'm taking the subway home.
What should I do?
Hell if I know.
Which has helped along with Heather's character design. I always liked her goofy jacket, since whenever she's feeling nervous about something, which is very often, she looks down and it's almost impossible to see her face. That's just perfection. The music is once again done by Akira Yamaoka, and evokes a sort of 2000s grunge vibe that is pretty excellent, pretty righteous and gnarly. I would also be remiss in at least mentioning Nora Stevens-Heath and her excellent job translating most of the game's flavor text, which includes the majority of Heather's internal monologues and observations. It's honestly one of my benchmarks for what a great localization can be, up there with Earthbound's. Beginning the game, what's unique is we're put into a premonition dream, where Heather is in an abandoned, decrepit amusement park. This location was technically present in Silent Hill 1, however, it was very basic and primarily existed as a stopgap to determine which ending you'll receive depending on how the Sybil encounter is handled, while here it is much more fleshed out and detailed. Heather has experienced this place before in a long-forgotten memory, a jagged puzzle piece, as it were, and this flash forward shows the long road Heather needs to take to reach a full understanding of herself. After being hit by a roller coaster, Heather wakes up with a start in a cafe, which, can I just say, is lovingly rendered. Like, I'd love to go here if this was a real place. I want to fall asleep here too, like one of those cats on stone stairs. Anyway, Heather goes to call her father, and you can tell from just how she expresses herself how good of a father she has.
Anyway, I'm coming home now. Oh, I didn't get that thing you asked me to. Okay. Okay, I will. I love you too, Dad.
We don't hear her father speak in this interaction, so the way that we understand their relationship is entirely through Heather and how she sees it, which is a really important decision I'll elaborate on later. Too bad that nice conversation gets interrupted by Douglas, who heckles Heather about wanting her to meet someone and her birth. He's being weird, and Heather understandably retreats to a nearby bathroom to escape. Examining the mirror in here, there's a pretty pivotal line that'll let play that I'll be referring back to multiple times. Oh boy. So this is the setup to the first half of the game, which is Heather's journey to get home to her father. Besides establishing the monsters and major characters for later, this section also helps you see the world the way that Heather sees the world. In a lot of ways, this reminds me of the structure of Dark Souls 1, bear with me here, in which the first half, while having important story context, mostly sets you loose in a series of environments you can only piece together through the eyes of the character you're playing as, without much of the wider scope being clear until later. Many of the places Heather has to navigate are locations that I'm sure she's been to before. The shopping mall for shopping, maybe a bit of sleuthing around empty construction sites in the sewers when she's bored, and so on. However, instead of having the familiarity of daylight and people, these places are empty and hostile, the architecture itself seeing fit to box Heather in. Another noteworthy thing established is Heather's capacity for violence. While a lot of this is Team Silent responding to critiques of Silent Hill 2's combat being rather clunky by comparison, I think it's very interesting textually that Heather is a much more capable fighter than James, particularly when looking at other examples of protagonists in horror games released roughly around the same time. While you can certainly play Mio in Fatal Frame 2 as a 360 no-scoping ghost murderer, outside of the camera obscura, she has no ways to physically defend herself. While you can find many methods of survival in Haunting Ground, most of the game is about hiding and managing Fiona's mental state, with direct confrontation handled by the best boy, who is a good boy, and we love him for it. Quite a few games, in order to accentuate horror, will limit the amount of agency you personally have with the game's mechanics to facilitate that. This type of framework is inherited from horror films, particularly the slasher and giallo craze from the 70s and 80s, and you can see a lot of survival horror games replicating these notions, particularly the Clock Tower series and its derivatives having the interface be point and click in order to create tension when being chased, not to mention all those tank control games. However, this framework is certainly not monolithic in the genre. Many of the foundational games of survival horror, such as Sweet Home, Alone in the Dark, and the Resident Evil series, has everyone you play as equally capable of violence. While they all feature restrictions in raw movement, the capacity of violence is not restricted. This of course relates to larger conversations on horror game trends and how eventually they morphed to incorporate more action elements, the catalyst of course being Resident Evil 4 in 2005, but that's outside the scope of this discussion. With this overall context in mind though, I find it to be a deliberate and conscious choice to give a teenage girl stronger mechanical design rather than weakening the mechanics for fear effect, and this is further reflected by the narrative itself acknowledging violence in the text. This means getting into a bit of a complex discussion on this section of the game, primarily that folks feel it's a little flat due to how much of it is Heather alone surviving environments with little in the way of interacting with other people. I don't necessarily disagree with people on this. This was certainly frustrating when I first played the game hot off the heels of moody depression sim Silent Hill 2. However, I think it's worth critically examining why the game is structured this way, so I'll elaborate on how I personally interpret games, and how that informs my perspective of what I'm going to be saying in regards to Silent Hill 3, along with future discussions on this channel. My perspective on art is to look at its unreality in order to reveal what truths it is saying. Film is an entirely fictional reality that we buy into as we watch it, and video games are similar in that regard. However, where video games differ is the fact that they are part of a super medium that is able to encompass filmic techniques along with literature techniques among other forms of expression. Video games are the only medium in which you can both watch a movie and also read a book along with play a game. I'm sure you've heard of the somewhat overused term ludonarrative before, and what that is getting at is seeing how you can reconcile all these disparate forms of engagement in a game to see a united whole. I personally struggle now to agree with critiques of media that boil down to something being unengaging due to having negative space within it. Of course, I'm also the weird person who thinks Jeanne Dielman is a genuinely engaging work that I've seen multiple times, but it doesn't mean I would necessarily recommend watching it yourself if that's not your vibe. I think video games as an art form are able to examine the idea of being engaging and still be seen as great. Many of my favorite games, such as Yume Nikki, Shadow of the Colossus, Hylix, and so on, use negative space in order to convey deeper emotions that are hard to express literally, just like with surrealist paintings, film, ballet, and so on. While you absolutely can read all those works through only literally stated things such as what is in dialogue or a note, I feel lenses that only involve that discard quite a lot of the actual tactile experience of playing games. Without external factors such as a walkthrough, Yume Nikki is a game where you primarily wander around dream worlds not understanding how they all fit together. The game does have an ending, so it does technically have a goal for you to fulfill, but the way the game presents that goal is very abstract. It's not encouraging you to finish it the same way you would, say, a platformer game, reinforced by its ending. It's just telling you to engage with it as a vibe unto itself. It wants you to experience what it is doing without needing to complete it or conquer it in that sense. Similarly, the majority of the time that you spend in Shadow of the Colossus, especially if you begin optimizing the Colossi fights through replays, is exploring the actual world that you're in. That is part of the game's moral ambiguity, since the slaying of all the Colossi is framed as a melancholic act. You are meant to feel conflicted when each of them die, and that is reflected through repeated playthroughs in which you're more and more faced with empty space. You're faced with nature that does not exist for you. My friend Malmrose Projects has a great video on Shadow of the Colossus that elaborates on this notion more.
To me, all of this downtime in the space of quiet, open expanses with nothing particularly exciting to do except take everything in, this is the space the game offers to the player to reflect on how trivial and worldly so much of what is going on in the story and in our lives and history really is. It's a chance to see that there's a whole world that exists as is, that does not think much of our lives or our ambitions, our worries and fears, etc. We get so caught up in what we do in the human world that we forget that the rest of the world doesn't abide by our rules, or live by our code, or consider us central.
The point that I'm trying to get at is that negative space is as much part of the text of a game as a literal actual thing that you can grasp. I don't feel it's a mistake on the part of the developers to have negative space, and I often feel that many game design trends seek to optimize out empty space in order to deliver content in ways that is as efficient as possible, which I think is often limiting to video games as a medium. Now, for Silent Hill 3 in particular, the reason it is using so much negative space is partly to convey Heather's emotional state, but it's also to convey broader notions on what it feels like to be a teenager. The game's contrast between quiet moments of exploration where you're by yourself and loud screeching noises where you're being attacked is meant to reflect social conditions that Heather experiences in her day-to-day life, only hyper-realized. Being a teenager often means having to deal with responsibilities they didn't have to before as a kid, and in many cases, a lot of children have to grow up too early due to abuse, trauma, etc. Going further with that, Silent Hill 3 is a game about death and revenge. Heather's capacity for violence means out of all of the original 3 protagonists, she is the most equipped to cause death to other people, which is incorporated into the text, I guess, ludonarratively resonantly, if you want to use that term. So the loud screeching violence is thus justified with that mechanic. You want the violence to stop, so you use violence. But how do you reconcile the emptiness, the negative space that you are constantly having to engage with? I personally read this similar to Shadow of the Colossus, in that the game wants you to contemplate what you are doing by causing death. By extension, it also wants you to think about death in a literal sense, since after all,
Dad, I'm home. Listen, something really crazy's going on. I think we should... Dad? Dad?
No!
One of the most resonant moments of the game is right after you defeat the crony that Claudia released to kill Harry, and you're able to simply walk around Heather's home before leaving. This is a space that is fundamentally changed by the events that have happened. All these signifiers, this lived-in notion, will fade away with time. Similarly, Heather's childhood innocence has been completely shattered by these events. She can no longer be her dad's little girl. She can only be herself. This speaks to real-life experiences I've had overcoming traumatic events from my childhood. Not literally, of course, but metaphorically. It's so easy to see yourself as an island, land existing in the sea to be inevitably eroded by the tide, but that's not reality, and it's not Heather's reality. And it's where I need to come clean a bit and for once properly explain something that's been going on in my personal life. I normally refrain from doing so since I greatly value my privacy, but what happened has greatly impacted a lot of how I view art and how I view Silent Hill 3 in particular. My father passed away from throat cancer last July. He was diagnosed late in 2022, and it went from there. That has been very emotionally complex for me, and I didn't feel comfortable with the process of creating videos until I felt I had emotionally processed and reconciled with what that meant to me sufficiently. What I'm left with is remnants of him both in physical objects he owned and spaces he occupied, but also in my memories of conversations I've had with him, experiences I've had with him, things he had wrote. My father was not a good person. He got heavily involved in substance abuse, and I was estranged from him for over a decade before he passed away. He was very emotionally abusive, and I still carry those scars with me. However, the influence he had on my life is complicated. Both his support and his abuse shaped a lot of how I view the world. Like Heather, I am a remnant of my parent. I can only do my best to embody the good things that were there, and contextualize the things that weren't. This is a major theme Silent Hill 3 is continually grappling with. How do you move on after the death of someone who impacted you so much? Do you turn to religion? To money? Do you turn to revenge or forgiveness? Do you turn to hatred or to love? Do you mold your own clay? Ultimately, many of these questions can't be answered. The correct way to move on often doesn't exist. The road ahead can be foggy and indistinct. It isn't written yet. All we can really do is keep living and try to understand the people around us, try and be seen by others, because the pain that you feel can only heal by living, by understanding how other people experience the same pain you are feeling. You can't be an island. You have to live. Okay, that was heavy, and I'm sorry for that. Let's go ahead and continue. After these events, the second half of the game begins, which in a lot of ways is completely different from what came before. While it's still often Heather alone, there are a lot more cutscenes and character interactions to contend with, including Douglas turning out to not actually be a creep. In this sense, the game is very backloaded, and I think it fits with the game because this coincides with Heather's evolving understanding of the world at large. She is venturing from the familiar into the unfamiliar. I've seen the critique that the titular town of Silent Hill in this game is fairly perfunctory, and I do actually agree, since it would be nice to have a few more optional locations aside from Heaven's Night, but I understand the intent is that this place doesn't mean that much to Heather or even Alessa. Heather's only goal is to find Claudia out of revenge. She isn't here to directly introspect on her guilt and anxieties, although the town certainly makes a lot of that manifest, so it makes sense that the progression would be more straightforward and linear. Of course, this could absolutely be attributed to a rushed development cycle, but I'd rather not speculate on what-ifs like that since they will never come to pass. I think it's better to just accept and understand the game as is, rather than what it could be. Going from that, Brookhaven Hospital, while in some respects a recycling of the concept in Silent Hill 2, incorporates many new elements that you didn't experience in that game, particularly the puzzles, the basement areas, and of course, Stanley. This is also where the game starts developing themes primarily related to, but not exclusively, women's fears, such as being stalked by someone or having an unwanted pregnancy. Since the game spent so much time building up Heather as somebody you can identify with, it hits a lot harder when you see many things that people experience in real life. We never confront Stanley directly, but his presence is felt through the atmosphere of the hospital itself. It makes you ponder what kind of place Silent Hill became due to the influence of the cult. Heather being treated as this godlike being that, contradictorily, needs to be protected is a reflection of the cult's influence on people's psyches, along with how the cult treats women in general, which is most evident with the Leonard fight and the implications of the fact that Claudia was physically abused by her father.
You hated your father, didn't you? I saw the way he hit you, and kicked you, made you cry. The memory of his cruelty is forever burned into my mind.
Yes, and that's why we need God.
Leonard, is that you?
Death to all who turn their backs on God!
Well, I guess you're not a person anyway.
The hospital also has one of the scariest moments in any Silent Hill, where you are locked into a room and you see rust build up on the mirror present, only for that rust to then infect the real world. Heather is getting closer to the truth of her existence, fully actualizing as a person, and that is manifesting in Silent Hill itself with her reflection becoming a monster that is trying to hurt her. Because remember, Heather is the unwilling origin point of these things. She is radiating the other world outwards from herself. So for me, I read this as a look at how Heather probably feels about herself at this point, as if there's something wrong with her that she can't stop. Shortly after, we return to the amusement park, and it's honestly probably my favorite part of the game. I love the aesthetic and the goofy little horror house parody you get to walk around in, and probably die to a lot because the camera screws you over for the 5th time. It's here where the echo of Alessa finally manifests and confronts Heather directly. In a sense, you can read this as Heather confronting her shadow self, Alessa representing many of her most negative aspects that she needs to overcome in order to be whole. With this, we start to gain insight into the childhood trauma that Heather experienced. While in the text, Heather is a reincarnation of Alessa and can be considered a separate person from Alessa, This is not a distinction that Heather makes. She remembers being Alessa, these tangible feelings and experiences, as real as her childhood of her beloved father, and the physical and emotional abuse that Alessa experienced is a reality of Heather's experience as well. The only difference is their ideological perspectives. The Alessa left behind, the Alessa who is a victim and died to the cult, wishes for even her memory to fade away, to give up, while Heather, remembering the same experiences, thinks differently. This resilience in the face of adversity, in the recollection of traumatic events, her determination against forces who seek to make her a victim, all this came from Heather having the support of people who care about her, especially her dad. Alessa is a victim through and through, but with the second chance that Heather received, that doesn't have to remain her reality. She can grow and change and fight, and that shows growth from how she initially viewed herself. Heather is not an imitation of herself, a shadow of reality. She is her own reality. Right after this, we're led into Silent Hill's church in a confrontation of Claudia, who continually goads Heather into becoming angry so that God can be born sooner. It's a fairly short scene, and I'll put off discussing Claudia properly for now, but I do find it interesting Heather has now begun to accept that part of herself she used to hate.
But I am Alessa. My little Claudia, my dear sweet sister.
Alessa? Is it you? Oh, how I've missed you.
I don't need another world. It's fine the way it is.
But you said it yourself. The world must first be cleansed with fire.
But that's not what I want now.
While in part she may be pretending to act as Alessa here in order to talk down Claudia, I also think she is genuinely starting to view Claudia as a sister and wants her to give up this doomer worldview. Briefly, I want to touch on the cult itself for a moment. What's interesting, if you look around, is that the remnants of the cult have rewritten what transpired in Silent Hill 1 in order to obfuscate the abuse that Alessa had to suffer, with both Alessa and Heather depicted as a holy mother and daughter, which hides away the abuse Alessa suffered and her intentions to escape from the cult through Heather. I get the vibe the cult is on its last legs, with many senior members of it being gone, and the only people left are the children, who are radicalized into believing a doomer, bleak perspective on the world. Additionally, I also want to provide a counter-argument to the idea that the game focusing on the cult aspect therefore means things are less ambiguous, and thus it loses a lot of the mystery and atmosphere that was present in Silent Hill 2. I disagree with this for various reasons. There are multiple ambiguities in Silent Hill 3 that are never directly explained. Why exactly is Alessa able to manifest to attack Heather, and why in this form? What is Vincent's endgame, and are the creatures Heather is attacking truly monsters, or people, and so on?
Don't stand there looking so smug. You're the worst person in this room. You come here and enjoy spilling their blood. And listening to them cry out. You feel excited when you step on them and snuff out their lives.
Are you talking about the monsters?
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
Oh no.
Don't worry. It's just a joke.
However, it's important to note that the ambiguities present in the game are not meant to be pondered just for their own sake, which was actually true of Silent Hill 2 as well. Most of the ambiguities in these games serve a narrative purpose. For instance, to what extent Maria is a clone of Mary or her own literal person is intentionally ambiguous because neither Maria or James knows. The point of Maria's character is not to solve her, it's to understand how James replicates the behaviors he acted out with his wife Mary when she was alive, and depending on your personal actions as a player determines exactly what happens to both of them. There isn't a whole lot of the major stuff in Silent Hill 2 that lacks an understandable explanation. For instance, even Pyramid Head technically has a lore justification. While the game is still of course open to some interpretation, it's a big reason it has so many different endings, the ambiguities present are informing the themes, characters, and narrative as opposed to supplanting them. Angela's story is heartbreakingly comprehensible, and you're meant to sit with the tragedy of it rather than lack true understanding of what it means. Silent Hill 3 is very much doing the same thing with its characters in order to critique cults that dehumanize individuals for some greater goal, and is also taking a great deal of time helping you understand the complexities and sadness of its protagonists, just like Silent Hill 2. And it frustrates me that people ignore this for a surface-level generalization that is not true. Now, if we do want to dive into some deliberately ambiguous aspects of Silent Hill 3 and what they mean, then I think a great place to start is the confession booth. So first, a peek behind the game's curtain. Behind the scenes, the game has an internal gauge to determine whether or not actions you are taking will give you the possessed ending, which I'll talk about in more depth later, but it's important to note that you can only get this ending on a subsequent playthrough. By default, the game just has one normal ending. Of course, you wouldn't naturally know this on a first playthrough, so when you're confronted with this woman who appears to have killed a girl who had murdered her daughter, you are meant to ponder what you think Heather should do here. Do you forgive this person, or do you remain silent? Heather literally is the mother of God in the religion, so she does have the authority to forgive someone or not if she wants, if we view things from that perspective. On the flip side, however, this woman killing someone out of revenge is a direct mirror to Heather's current situation. While Heather has a more natural inclination for violence, she is still a kid and she doesn't know the world the way an adult would. How does she know the revenge she's taking on Claudia is just if, from Claudia's worldview, what she did to Harry was completely justified? How do you reconcile these different perspectives, trying to remain empathic to other people even as they do harmful things to you personally? These are all very complex questions the narrative is grappling with, and you get to choose how you want to interpret this from whether or not you choose to forgive this woman. For my part, I always choose to forgive her because I don't view Heather forgiving her as an act of divine forgiveness, so much as a stepping stone for this woman to try and make amends now that part of her religious guilt has been quelled. This woman is part of a cult, but it's questionable to what extent she even had a choice in being indoctrinated, so I don't think attempting to abstain would help matters here. At the same time, I can completely understand a perspective where you choose to say nothing, because while this woman's situation is sad, it is also not necessarily Heather's responsibility to be the judge on whether or not she does deserve forgiveness, since after all, she lacks full context and ultimately can't be the one who causes change. All this from a completely optional scene that is not required at all to beat the game. It's pretty great. I would also be remiss not discussing what a lot of the creature designs and incidental scares in this game mean, particularly since, like Silent Hill 1, we know that these are a direct projection from Alessa and her subconscious fears, the complexities and ambiguities in the context of 3 coming from whether or not many of these images are originating from Alessa's echoes or Heather herself. Some of them can relate to specific fears that Heather is experiencing in the now, such as body dysmorphia or unwanted pregnancies, but some are very clearly originating from Alessa, such as the storybook monster in the office building. Perhaps most interesting is when Alessa herself manifests in these monsters, since I believe this is both reflecting Alessa's anger towards what has happened to her and Heather's fear of her shadow self. The nurses, for instance, reflect both Alessa and Lisa Garland, and perhaps the way that they are manifesting also represents how Heather is scared to become a faceless object. Since if you recall, that was what many people read their narrative purpose in Silent Hill 2 to be when viewing them from James's eyes. Bringing us back to Leonard, perhaps the reason he looks like a monster but is able to talk normally is because Alessa's echoes are the ones projecting onto Leonard, what she thinks of him, since after all, she would have been fully aware of the abuse Claudia is suffering from him when they were growing up. Exploring the church itself brings up old memories for Heather, both in the literal of ghosts haunting her, but also from the religious iconography that is present, paintings of her as Alessa, old drawings she used to make with her sister Claudia. I refer to Claudia as Heather's sister, so let me clarify what I mean. To Alessa, Claudia really was someone she viewed as her sister, but of course to Heather she is her father's murderer. But I think it's important to understand how this came about. While Heather was granted a second chance and was able to escape the influence of the cult, Claudia was left behind with only her memories of who Alessa once was. Unlike Heather, who received the support of her father, Claudia faced nothing but abuse from hers, making the cult's ideology become as intrinsic as breathing. Essentially, Claudia is the sibling who wasn't able to escape abuse and was broken by it. It's incredibly tragic. Now to discuss the cult's ideology more directly. Let's circle back to Vincent's infamous line.
They look like monsters to you?
This line often gets misread to mean that Heather was killing innocent people but was perceiving them as monsters, which is definitely not true. There are multiple normal humans visible even during times Heather is seeing monsters, such as when she gets her pistol, and of course Vincent, Claudia, and so on. We are not given any particular reason before this point to doubt Heather's perspective on events, and if we account for Silent Hill 1, then the other world and its manifested monsters are definitely real, since we see them through Harry's eyes. But it does give us insight into how cult members view the other world and what kind of world they want to create. A world of pain and destruction in which everyone suffers equally in order to end unequal suffering. Wow, sounds great. Perhaps what Vincent is criticizing here is Heather's use of violence, because Vincent is working against this world of suffering and is seeing Heather, primarily in self-defense, cause suffering. Of course, Vincent is not unbiased, like he's kind of only here for the money.
Go home, Vincent.
Home. This church is my home. I built it with my power. The power of money that you view with such scorn.
But I think the game wants you to ponder the small grain of truth in this poison, rather than wonder if the whole game is a hallucination or something. Heather is not in a coma going on adventures with Pikachu. Ponder and keep going. Now, finally, in a far-off corner of the church, Heather stumbles upon this rather strange room that looks like her dad's room in her real house. In it, she finds a diary written by her dad, where he expresses his fears and regrets on how he was raising Heather, how he initially viewed her similar to the person who stole Cheryl away from him. I viewed this room, similar to the manifestations of Alessa, as a metaphorical projection of deeper things that Heather needs to confront. There are remnants of real memories and experiences that Heather has had before. She has been in this exact room before, looking at the body of her father. I'm sure there's been many times where she's worried about how her father perceives her, whether she's living up to his expectations, whether he truly loves her. This small section is very understated, but it honestly hits me the most personally. The last confrontation of Claudia is interesting because the solution to the problem of Heather birthing God doesn't come from Vincent's suggestion to use the Seal of Metatron. The seal was present in Silent Hill 1, and it's heavily implied that its true usage is to enable the cult's god rather than destroy it, so I do actually think Claudia is telling the truth here that it's a piece of junk. From what I can gather, Vincent came to the conclusion that the seal is a key element to prevent the god's awakening from misinformation spread by cult members, similar to how Alessa's act of defiance was reincorporated to be an act of divine significance. The solution ends up not being violence, since you get a non-standard game over for attempting it, but by using the locket Heather received from her father, which contains a small capsule that expels the god from her. This concept was present in Silent Hill 1, but I will admit the implementation here, while consistent with the game's overarching themes about violence and parenthood, is a bit clumsy, since it's fully possible you wouldn't realize the pendant is the solution here. That said, you can view this similar to Mary's letter in Silent Hill 2, in that what it means as an object to you as a player changes from the experience of playing the game. Using the capsule causes a frankly absolutely horrifying and disgusting scene where Claudia willingly births the god, and Heather has to finally confront and defeat this last vestige of Alessa the cult held onto. It's quite a difficult fight, and it actually caused me to not be able to finish my very first playthrough from a lack of resources. But it's also a fitting fight for the story, and feels like a full culmination of everything that has happened so far. After defeating the god, Heather's quest for revenge is complete, and all that's left now is the remnants, to finally come to terms with the fact that her father is gone forever.
Is that the end? I guess it's time to roll the credits.
Alright, so let's discuss the three endings of the game. The first one has Heather pretend to try and attack Douglas before saying she's joking, along with accepting that her real name is Cheryl and not Heather, fully reclaiming her identity from the cult and moving on as a new person. I've seen some people take issue with Cheryl's supposedly cheery attitude in these scenes, which I think derives from a misunderstanding of what masking is psychologically. Of course, Cheryl isn't going to confide in Douglas over everything that's happened, since she really doesn't know him all that well, so she is putting on a cheerier front in order to cope with her trauma in the moment. Relatable. The second ending, the possessed ending I mentioned earlier, is much more dark, but also informs quite a lot of the game's themes, in which Heather really does murder Douglas in cold blood. Many fans interpret this ending to be Heather fully embracing the cult itself or becoming possessed, and I also see interpretations that this ending is non-canon to the game itself, similar to the UFO ending. Let's start with the ending's canonical status. Nowhere is it stated in the game itself that this ending is not canon, and I don't recall any developer interviews claiming as such, although I could be wrong. Also, unlike the Rebirth ending in Silent Hill 2, there are no New Game Plus items that are required in order to receive this ending. The only metric that matters is how much damage Heather takes, how many enemies you kill, and whether or not you forgive the woman in the church, along with beating the game at least once. But let's assume that this ending is actually non-canon. Even if that's the case, I still think this is revealing something important about the characters that should be considered. Like, the dog ending in Silent Hill 2 is clearly meant as a joke and isn't meant to be taken seriously, but it does still reveal something about James if we do interpret this to be a projection from the town. Throughout many of the endings, James often displaces his guilt by deferring it to somebody else, such as going off with Maria to replace Mary, or seeking the old gods to revive Mary, and so on. You can totally read this as James coming up with any excuse to not confront reality, hence the best boy showing up. The UFO ending in Silent Hill 3 does something a bit similar. While it is intended to be goofy and ridiculous, if we take this as a serious ending, then the fact that it shows an alive Harry that Heather can stay with using these childish drawings can be interpreted to mean Heather is escaping a harsh reality of her father being dead. I don't think it literally needs to happen for it to convey this. It can still convey something about the characters through the way that this branches off from the original source material. Now, the fact that the possessed ending is locked behind New Game Plus could indicate that it is therefore not canon, but consider how many games have endings that are only accessible through a New Game Plus route. For instance, Undertale, Nier Automata, Chrono Trigger, and the Zero Escape games. I rarely see anyone argue those endings are non-canon due to that requirement, so why should it apply here? I'm being overly pedantic on these small details because I feel people are too keen to dismiss what this ending's indicating about the game's narrative. I don't think this ending is literally saying that Heather is now possessed by the cult or its god in order to do evil. This possibility is never stated in the game itself, and it would also heavily contradict what the plot of the game is, which is Heather carrying the god. If the cult could have possessed Heather directly instead, why didn't they earlier? If the god itself is possessing Heather, then what was the point of the final boss? So for me, I interpret this ending as Heather embodying what the society around her wants her to be to a toxic degree. She is possessed by the notions of what the cult wanted from her, which is to be violent, ruthless, nihilistic, and not care about anyone, because those are the methods that the cult believes is needed in order to create a new world, kind of like what Claudia believes, and Claudia was not literally possessed by anything. I view this ending as the other side of the coin, a potentially different answer to what Heather was talking about with how Alessa viewed the same events they both experienced. One ending has Cheryl embrace life, the other has Alessa embrace death. Seeing Heather crouch at her father's grave reminds me of a song that my father was a fan of, Save Tonight by Eagle Eye Cherry. The song is about a man who has to go away from the woman he loves after one more night. It's a good song on its own, but after my father's death, it took on a deeper meaning. It's a song about the fear of the future, the fear of the unknown, and I often wonder if this is something that he was thinking of through his years of substance abuse and through his cancer treatments. But I will never know the answer to that, and that's okay. My father lived, and he died, and I can use what remains to mold my own clay. Thank you very much for watching this video. I apologize for uploading rather infrequently, but I do intend to get on a more regular schedule of uploading now that this video is complete, with a few projects of mine being in the middle of the scripting and recording phase. Ideally, I'd like to make a video at least about this length every month or so if possible. I know this video is quite depressing, but do note that I am doing fine and have been feeling much more optimistic and motivated recently. I have good friends, and I'm emotionally stable, so please don't take this video as a sign that I'm in a dark place, so much as an expression of something I've needed to deal with. Thank you to my patrons for supporting my video making and for your patience. Thank you as well to Spasbo 4 and World of Longplays for additional footage from Silent Hill 2 and the alternate endings from Silent Hill 3 used in this video. Anyway, I hope y'all have a great day, and I'll see you later.
Music make you lose control. Music